Thank you. Okay. Good morning, Clackamas County. I'm going to call to order the June 12, 2024 Clackamas County Board of Commissioners Land Use hearing. I will now lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance. Please stand. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Good morning. We are holding this hearing in person and via Zoom. The Zoom link and the instructions to participate are located on the website. Today we will consider ZDO 288, a package of amendments to the Clackamas County Comprehensive Plan and Zoning and Development Ordinance that primarily addresses utility facilities and related issues to allow a broader range of utility facilities to qualify as primary or accessory uses rather than conditional uses. Public testimony will be taken this morning. If you are participating in person and wish to testify, please fill out a blue card. They actually might be green, but they're on the table right over there. And place it in the basket, and you will be called to testify at the appropriate time. If you are participating via Zoom and wish to testify, we will prompt you regarding how to do that when the time is right. When you are called on, please be sure to include your name and the area where you live. I would like to remind all participants, including staff, elected officials, and member of the public, that Robert's Rules of Order will be enforced during this hearing. We welcome you and your opinions and look forward to your polite participation. The hearing this morning will proceed as follows. We will first hear a presentation from our Planning Director, Jennifer Hughes. I will then open the hearing for public testimony, beginning with public officials. If any public official wishes to testify, they will have 5 minutes each. Then representatives of any organized community planning organizations and agencies who wish to testify will each have 3 minutes. Finally, members of the public wishing to testify will have 3 minutes each. The board will then deliberate and either render a decision today or set a time to make a decision at a later date. Assisting us in the hearing today is our clerk, Caroline Hill. To my right, we have the Planning Director, Jennifer Hughes, and the Assistant County Counsel, Caleb Hugel. We will now begin the hearing on ZDO 288 with planning staff's presentation of their report and recommendation. Thank you. Ready for the staff presentation?
Good morning. While Caroline is bringing the screen down here, again, for the record, I'm Jennifer Hughes. I'm the Planning Director. I'll be giving the staff report today. I guess just want to start with some formalities, and I will say you're going to get kind of a typical land use staff report that you're all accustomed to getting. And then I will try to sum up at the end what I think the probably key policy issue is, because this issue is more complicated than it may seem at first when you're trying to draft code amendments related to utility facilities. So what we're considering, just tell you when I'm ready. Okay. So Caroline's going to advance the slides as I tell her to. So we're ready for you can go to the next slide, please. So what you're considering today are legislative text amendments to the Comprehensive Plan and the Zoning and Development Ordinance to revise and clarify how utility-related land uses are regulated. Next slide. By way of background, and I know the board is familiar with much of this, but for the public as well, historically, utility facilities inside road rights-of-way in the county have proceeded through a utility permit process without land use review by planning and zoning. It's just the way it's been done. The county issues really hundreds, actually thousands of utility permits a year for various utility-related work in our rights-of-way, and those have not historically gone through land use review. Outside rights-of-way, it's been slightly different in that we've known that state law has required review for some of those utility facilities in certain zones for a long time, but it's really not an application that we've seen. In other zones where state law does not control, again, the county has not historically viewed utility lines as requiring land use review unless there's some sort of environmental issue. Maybe if you're doing something in a floodplain or something like that, there could have been standards. Within the last 6 to 8 months, we had cause to do a deeper analysis of our zoning code and realized that based on sort of the plain language, which refers to utility facilities and the broad meaning of the word facility, that it appears that land use review is required for utility lines. When we began thinking about amending the code, we also wanted to look at other utility-related provisions that we had that we've realized were kind of in need of updating. So first of all, our definition, we define something public utility facility. It's really narrower than what we think of commonly as utilities. It doesn't cover everything, which creates some complexity in reviewing certain types of utility facilities. In addition, the county has a requirement for the undergrounding of certain types of utility lines. Historically, that's been viewed as applying to service lines, so those individual lines that serve an individual commercial use or an individual home, but not generally to larger scale distribution and transmission lines. But the code is not entirely clear with regard to that, so it seemed like a good time to consider clarifying one way or the other the scope of that requirement. Next slide, please. We came to the board in November last year to talk about the potential for initiating amendments to our code once we realized that we might be needing to require conditional use permits for a couple thousand utility permits a year, and that created some administrative really problems for us in trying to absorb that workload. And there was really a question about whether all utility facilities warrant that level of review. So you held a policy session in November and voted to initiate zoning code amendments. That was a fairly broad proposal at that time, but the board acknowledged in your conversations that you were going to listen to what the Planning Commission said, the public said, and that the proposal could certainly be narrowed during this public review process. But initially, the amendments that were initiated were to allow all utilities in rights-of-way and all utility lines outside rights-of-way outright. So what would remain subject to land use review would be non-linear utility facilities outside rights-of-way. So things like sewer treatment plants, water reservoirs, power substations, those kinds of things, but not linear facilities. So that's where this started last November. In February, staff held a study session with the Planning Commission to just bring them up to speed on the prior conversations the board had had and the work that staff had done on evaluating the code, and then scheduled public hearings before the Planning Commission in April, which they held, and then ended up setting it over for a decision in May. So the Planning Commission actually had 2 public hearings regarding this. Next slide, please. So the scope of the amendments, or what I like to call what this doesn't do. So I want to start with what we're not doing here today. No changes are proposed in the county's exclusive farm use, timber, and ag forest zones because those farm and forest zones are regulated heavily by state law and the county is limited in terms of what we can do that differs from those requirements. No changes are proposed to our environmental or hazard regulations. So if there is a requirement currently to do some kind of review of a utility line or a utility facility in a floodplain, a stream buffer, on a steep slope, to the extent we currently have requirements, those would continue to apply. Some things are exempt, but no changes proposed. In addition, and it's not on the slide, I want to reiterate that those facilities that I just mentioned outside rights-of-way, things like treatment plants, substations, reservoirs, there has been no consideration or discussion about not requiring land use review for those. So that would continue to occur the way it has for decades. Next slide. So we talked about what it doesn't do. Now let's talk about what it does do. This is a summary of the proposal. And again, we started in one place and it's been narrowed somewhat. So I'm going to talk about how it's changed since November. But broadly, the proposal is to adopt and revise utility-related definitions. So specifically, I mentioned that definition of public utility facility. So we would have a broader, more comprehensive definition of utility facility. A definition for utility line, for utility service line, which is those individual lines to individual uses that I mentioned, and revisions to our definition of right-of-way, which our current definition is a little odd and just really not comprehensive enough. In addition, there's a proposal, as I mentioned, to clarify the requirements for underground utility lines. As drafted, it would continue what has been the practice of requiring service lines to be underground unless the utility provider prohibits it for some reason. But larger lines, distribution, transmission, those would not be required to be underground. There's also a proposal to add specific utility-related accessory uses. We have allowed things like utility service lines, of course, it seems, of course, as accessory uses over the years, but the code really doesn't spell it out very specifically. There's sort of a broader customary accessory use category, so the idea here is to be a little more explicit about the kinds of utility facilities that somebody can do in conjunction with a dwelling or a commercial use on their property. We're also proposing some minor and conforming amendments, so I'd just like to mention that. Of course, the full proposal was in your packet and is available on our website. Next slide. So really the heart of this proposal gets to the question about what is allowed as a primary use, meaning no land use review outside of any environmental or hazard regulations that would apply, versus what requires someone to file a land use application. In this context, we're talking about conditional use permits. The proposal before you now would allow as a primary use anything utility related that occurs within a road right-of-way. Mostly, those are going to be utility lines, because the right-of-way really, people aren't building, sewer treatment plants in our road rights-of-way. But there are occasionally some things that are nonlinear that may be utility-related that could happen in a right-of-way without land use review as this is drafted. In addition, the proposal would allow some utility lines outside rights-of-way as an outright permitted use. And I'm going to come back to which lines those are in just a minute. And then specified nonlinear stormwater facilities outside the right-of-way. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, but of course, stormwater facilities, yes, you can have stormwater lines, but you also have things that are nonlinear that are pretty routine to deal with stormwater. So it could be a linear, but be a drainage way. So it's not a pipe. It's something that's sort of more natural, if you will, or a detention pond, which we've all seen. Next slide. So conditional uses would continue to be required, as I mentioned, for all of those other nonlinear facilities like reservoirs and pump stations and those kinds of things. In addition, most nonlinear facilities currently are allowed through a conditional use process in a lot of our zones, but there are a couple of residential zones where I think it was just an oversight. They don't currently have an allowance for a conditional use permit for any type of utility facilities, so we are proposing to add that into 2 of our village residential zones. Again, that would be through a conditional use process. What would also require a conditional use, this is under the Planning Commission's recommendation, are larger, and by larger I mean not service lines, so distribution and transmission lines for only natural gas and electric. So we're not talking about water lines, sewer lines, stormwater lines, communication lines, just natural gas and electric lines, only outside the right-of-way and only on land not owned or controlled by the utility provider. So as the Planning Commission has recommended, this would be above ground or below ground lines, provided they're natural gas and electric, outside the right-of-way on land the utility does not own or control. So what that really means is if condemnation is required in order to establish part of a natural gas or electric line, land use review would be required. But everything else would be allowed outright. So that's where this sort of, I talked about how we knew it might get narrowed as it came to you. And that is how the Planning Commission's recommendation narrowed where we originally started, which was all utility lines would be allowed outright. Next slide. So just sort of the technical details, staff has written a staff report for the Planning Commission, which is in your packet, that goes through some analysis and findings of all of the approval criteria for this type of code amendment. Statewide planning goals, the Metro Urban Growth Management Functional Plan, the county's comprehensive plan, and the county's zoning and development ordinance, and has concluded that the proposal does comply with all of those. We will need to make some amendments to those potentially for your formal adoption if you make changes today to the proposal. But we do believe that really anything that's under consideration at this point would be compliant with those standards. Next slide. So significant issues. We've gone through this process. We've gone to the Planning Commission. We've taken public testimony. Staff's done research and consideration. We've talked to some utility providers. What I've identified here are the issues that really emerged as kind of the top points of concern or discussion during this process. First one being stormwater infrastructure. In particular, the Planning Commission, we have at least one or two planning commissioners who have quite a bit of expertise in this area, and they were concerned that stormwater infrastructure isn't always like other infrastructure. It may not be linear. You might have these sort of above-ground vegetated retention facilities. They wanted to make sure that the regulations covered that in sort of an equitable way with other types of utilities. So staff made some amendments to the package in between when the Planning Commission saw it the first time and what you have now, and that addressed their concerns. So that issue, I think, is resolved. I'm not aware that there's any outstanding concerns about that. The second significant issue was related to overhead electric lines. So you will have noticed in your packet, you have a number of pieces of written testimony that have been submitted. And by and large, those focus on concerns about overhead electric transmission lines. Not 100% necessarily, but for the most part, most of the testimony has focused on that question. The Planning Commission did have concerns about impacts of those type of facilities. They had concerns about safety, about resiliency of those kinds of facilities, overhead lines potentially being more of a wildfire hazard or being more susceptible to damage during ice storms, and power outages being a greater concern. So they talked about that. They also talked about kind of the trade-offs between the county potentially requiring, and we really didn't pursue much research on our authority to do this, but requiring even large-scale electric distribution and transmission lines to be underground, that we would just say that's mandatory. They talked about that. But in the end, I think the conclusion was that there are trade-offs involved. Simply undergrounding a transmission line isn't as simple as it might sound. And there is some testimony from PGE in your packet that kind of talks about some of those trade-offs. And one of the major ones is cost. It can, as I understand it, result in something like a 10-fold increase in the cost of the line in order to underground it, which has impacts on all ratepayers in the community. And so I think in the end that was persuasive to the Planning Commission. And so what they settled on was a comprehensive plan policy that's more aspirational, that talks about how the county will support, encourage, facilitate the undergrounding of these larger lines. And we have actually, I know, partnered with PGE on at least one or two grant applications to the federal government trying to fund those types of projects. But they settled on that aspirational goal as opposed to a requirement. Safety. So the Planning Commission in their recommendation really focused on the next two bullets: concerns about safety of utility lines and concerns about public outreach and involvement. And those were really the two things they talked most about in terms of trying to decide which types of utility lines warranted a conditional use permit. They felt that electrical and natural gas were the ones that potentially posed safety concerns and really didn't have those concerns about water or stormwater or sewer lines. Ultimately, though, they didn't settle on wanting a conditional use permit for all electrical and natural gas lines of larger sizes. So I don't think in the end that safety really ended up being something that caused them to push the idea of having a conditional use permit. Public outreach and involvement, they talked about that a lot. There was some concern about, well, if a utility has to go to the Public Utility Commission, does that somehow provide adequate public involvement that we could not require land use approval? And based on our research, yes, the PUC has some outreach requirements depending upon the specifics, but they do not review all utility projects. And for instance, with a transmission line, they may only get involved if it's below a certain size of, they only get involved if there's condemnation involved. And it's really about that condemnation piece and not so much about the types of impacts on property owners or the community that you normally evaluate through a conditional use permit. And then the final significant issue, and this is one that this is really coming from staff, and that is the question about implementation complexity and how through this process, depending upon what we end up adopting, it shapes the administrative complexity. And of course, I've talked to you about this before, about concerns about sort of the long-term viability of our planning program and needing to streamline our code and make things make sense so that new staff understand it more easily, we can explain it more easily, the public and utility providers can follow along more easily. So I spent a lot of time trying to think about how would we do this in a way that's the least complex if we're going to require conditional use permits for some kinds of utility lines. The Planning Commission landed on this condemnation piece. If the utility doesn't own or control the land, they need a conditional use permit, but otherwise they don't. That does create the potential that, lines are weaving in and out of different places. Sometimes it's in the right-of-way, sometimes it's in an existing easement, sometimes the property owner says, sure, I'll sell you an easement, and occasionally there's spots where condemnation will be required. That does make the review, I guess, a little interesting. Do we get one conditional use permit for the entire line, but only these 3 poles? Is it the impacts of only these 3 poles that are being, where condemnation's required that we're evaluating? It's potentially complex. The problem is with the nature of utility lines, it's hard to eliminate the complexity completely because by their nature, they're everywhere. It's an interconnected web. So they're going in and out of cities, they're going in and out of the right-of-way, they're going in and out of easements, potentially they need new easements. It's hard to eliminate it completely. I think there are ways, depending on where your discussion goes today, that we could make it simpler, and happy to kind of talk about that as you take testimony and your discussion evolves about different criteria that you could use. Next slide, please. So the Planning Commission, as I said, held 2 public hearings, one in April and one in May. Testimony was taken at the first one, deliberation and decision at the second one. There were only 6 parties who testified orally at the Planning Commission, but you do have, as you'll see, quite a bit of written testimony, and the Planning Commission had access to a lot of that as well. Ultimately, the Planning Commission recommendation was on a 5-2 vote. The 2 who voted no generally seem to express support for no conditional use permits for any utility lines. The 5 who voted in favor voted for, of course, the proposal that you have before you today, which was to approve the ZDO 288 text amendments as initially recommended by staff, which is what came from your November policy session, except to require a conditional use for larger, and by larger it means not service lines, but everything else, natural gas and electric lines that are outside the right-of-way on land not currently owned or controlled by the utility provider, which my shorthand means condemnation. That is what I believe that would mean. And in addition, they also excluded if a line had received some other kind of land use approval. So say there's a new subdivision, it's gone through land use approval, they need to extend natural gas to serve the subdivision, that would be captured by that subdivision approval and wouldn't require a separate conditional use permit. Next slide. So the staff is recommending one technical fix to the Planning Commission's recommendation, and that is a revision to the draft definition of right-of-way. I don't think there's really any significant issue with this. We're just trying to clean this definition up, and I think our first draft didn't quite hit the mark, and so we're proposing that you would adopt this edit to the Planning Commission's recommendation. And I want to sum up by saying I kind of promised to do this at the beginning. Now you've heard this whole technical report, you've heard a lot of options, we were here, we were there, maybe we could do this, maybe we could do that. What I think the most significant policy issue is for the board to consider is that question of what types of utility lines should require land use review. That would be a conditional use permit, or if there was a pre-existing facility, they could do it through a non-conforming use review. But in the end, it's land use review of some kind, which involves public notice, the ability to appeal, and to kind of go through that whole process in a public way like we do with land use. Which types of lines warrant that? And I think the ways to think about it, I'm sure there's a bunch of ways we could think about it, but the ones that seem to have emerged for me, the type of utility. Do we feel the same about water as we do about natural gas, or the same about sewer as we do about electric? Above or below ground? Maybe if they're just going to trench and bury something, yes, there's impacts during construction, but after that, do any of us really know it's there? So that's one possibility. The size of the line. So I don't think anybody's talking about conditional use permits for service lines. But the larger categories, distribution lines, do we care about those, or is it really just transmission lines, the 100-foot tall towers or 70-foot tall towers with above-ground transmission lines on them? And then where? Do we feel the same way about things in the right-of-way that we feel about things in a public utility easement? Do we feel the same about ones in the right-of-way as we do for a circumstance where they need condemnation? And so I would suggest that those are ways to maybe frame your thinking today. What kind of utility, above or below ground? How big is this line? What are the impacts? How significant? And where? Right away, easement, condemnation. And with that, I am done, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Ms. Hughes. We really appreciate that presentation. Fantastic job. I just want to pause for a moment and let everybody know that Chair Smith is actually joining us virtually today, so we're excited to have her join this meeting and participate so she can hear everything. I'm sure she'll have comments for us later on this issue. But we have a full board today, not just the four of us, which we're excited about. And thank you, Chair, for joining us. Do we have any questions or comments right now initially from anybody on the Board of County Commissioners?
I'd just like to hear the public testimony. Yeah, I'd like to hear the public testimony first, please.
Okay. Any questions for Ms. Hughes? Anybody? Comments for Ms. Hughes? Okay. It looks like that we don't have any further questions, Ms. Hughes.
Not yet.
Not yet. They're coming. So we will now move to public testimony. I will now open the hearing for public testimony, beginning with public officials. Do any public officials wish to testify? You will each have 5 minutes. Any elected officials in the audience? I don't see anybody.
Planning Commission Chair.
More, if we have the Chair of the Planning Commission, please come forward. Perfect, thank you. You will have 5 minutes, sir.
Good morning, Commissioners. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
I did not bring 8 pages today. I only brought 1. And I have to commend planning on this. They did fantastic work on this. And the write-up that Ms. Hughes just delivered to you is an excellent description of what happened during the Planning Commission. We had approximately 7.5 hours of hearings and workshop. This was some of the toughest work we've done. This is a tough one. But anyway, I'll give you my 1 page, and if you have any questions, please don't hesitate. The Planning Commission started working on this recommendation on February 26th in a study session.
Hold on. Can you just identify who you are really quick?
I'm sorry.
Yep.
Yeah. My name's Gerald Murphy. I chair the Clackamas County Planning Commission. I live in Rhododendron.
Oh, perfect. Thank you. Thank you. Please proceed. I didn't mean to, sorry for interrupting.
Okay. The Planning Commission started working on this recommendation on February 26th in a study session. 1 hour after, or 1.5 hours, was dedicated to ZDO 288 with a fair amount of public testimony given. On April 8th, a hearing was held on ZDO 288 that lasted 2.5 hours. We had a stack of written testimony to review and in-person testimony, which highlights how important this amendment is. The public had shown up. Many questions from the Planning Commission could not be answered that night. This meant leaving the record open and continuing in May. Jennifer and Joy prepared a phenomenal answers to the questions that were asked by the Planning Commission on April 8th. That was commented by Planning Commissioner Stevens. The Planning Commission hearing boils down to citizens of Clackamas County wanting to preserve a voice to their opinion, to voice their opinions on ideas on projects that shape the future of the community. Continuing to require conditional use permitting, as described in proposal in front of you, gives members of the community opportunity to voice their opinions at county level. The first 3 amendments of ZDO 288 are recommended by Planning Commission as written by staff. The recommendation for the 4th amendment of the Board of County Commissioners is conditional use permit requirements for gas and electric lines outside of the right-of-ways, properties owned or controlled by the utility and not subject to other land use approval processes. Any questions?
No, thank you for your testimony.
Thank you very much.
And thank you. Next, we will have Meredith Armstrong with PGE. Please tell us your name, and you have 3 minutes.
Thank you, Commissioners. My name is Meredith Armstrong. I am here on behalf of PGE. I am the Property Rights Manager for PGE. I just wanted to give a brief statement in support of the original ZDO amendment that Planning staff did put forward. I think that it really helps kind of streamline things. It keeps certainty for utilities to be able to plan into the future. And really kind of keeps us focused on trying to build it out in the right of way where we can. And then also, I think it treats all utilities the same, and so there's no issues of equity. So also, for the record, we did submit earlier this morning another letter from our Planning and Sustainability Director of Policy to just kind of further these points. So that will also be part of the written record. And again, we just wanted to thank the commission and the planning staff for all the time that has gone into this. We understand that this has been a very complex issue, and appreciate the chance to testify in support of that original planning staff's amendment. As well, we do have quite a number of our staffs that are subject matter experts on particular items. So if there are questions that come up along the way, we are happy to answer any of those questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Meredith. I do see a number of the PGE clan here today. Thank you for coming. There may be questions that we might need some information on. Yeah, thank you for testifying today.
Thank you.
I have a Mr. Randall Yamada. Please identify yourself and where you live, and you will have 3 minutes, Mr. Yamada.
Thank you. My name's Randall Yamada, and I am from the Stafford area
Really quick, we'll have you sit down so that we can hear you in the mic for the record. And then you pull into the mic, and then you'll have 3 minutes, but that just allows us to all hear you well.
Sure.
Thank you.
So I'm from the Stafford area, and I'm the Stafford Tualatin Valley CPO chairperson. And I'm here to support the idea that was brought forth by the Planning Commission, and also the ideas that are being expressed by the residents of the Stafford Road area. And one thing, I had some prepared comments, but when I saw the right-of-way definition brought up and brought down really quick, I didn't get a chance to really take a look at that definition. And what I'm really concerned about is if that definition is inclusive of areas outside the road right-of-way. And when I glanced at it and just tried to it looked like that it was possible that they were including those areas, and that in a lot of cases could eliminate the possibility of the public being able to respond to a major utility transmission line project. And so if I would appreciate it if you guys could go over that again and really take a close look at that definition and evaluate what it actually is saying. And so we support the efforts of the Stafford Road, Safe Stafford Road organization, and to prevent an industrial level utility line project cutting through their community and properties. And no one that I've talked to believes the zoning ordinance should allow this type of this level of transmission lines without public input included in conditional use type processing. But I think in the long run, this Stafford Road effort will be positive for our communities in the same way tolling and pricing brought neighborhoods and communities together to advocate for our future quality of life. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Yamada. I'm going to try to make sure I pronounce this name correctly. Please forgive me if I do not. Is it Letkes? Right, John Letkes? Yeah. Please, for the record, come up, identify yourself, and correct my pronunciation if I did it incorrectly, and your area of residence. Thank you. You have 3 minutes.
Okay, so I apologize. I wasn't planning on being here today, but, and the reason for that is I got Jennifer Hughes' copy of what was supposed to be presented today. It was 5 line items, you know, and I didn't see I didn't go online and see all the rest of this. And I just want to kind of bring up a couple things, kind of how we got from wherever we were to here. Originally, Jennifer Hughes and your staff was pretty much going to give PG carte blanche. They didn't have to get any permits. They can come by and put a pole in my front yard. Nothing I can do about it. Had Stafford Road, Save Stafford Road, had we not stepped in, that would have happened, okay? So, and that's just irresponsible. And it really takes away, you know, the good work that you guys do. I think it's shameful, quite frankly. And I think it's interesting that Meredith over here went down to the PUC and testified that that Jennifer was going to change all the rules just to accommodate PGE. I mean, that is just not a fair fight, you know? It's just not. And so, you know, anyway, I'm here today. You know, we were fine with the 5-2 vote. We appreciated that. But I only saw the 5 line items. So I just want to ask Jennifer for the record. My understanding is that in order to put high voltage transmission lines outside the right of way, you got to get a conditional use permit, or I know I'm running out of time here. Let's see. And I apologize. I wasn't gonna. Yeah, you got to get a non-conforming use permit or a conditional use permit if you want to put high voltage transmission lines outside the right of way. Is that under your proposal here? Is that correct?
Would you like me to answer?
Go ahead.
As recommended by the Planning Commission, the conditional use permit would be required if the utility needs to condemn property. So if they need to condemn property, it would be necessary. If there's a public utility easement already outside the right-of-way, it would not require a conditional use permit as recommended by the Planning Commission.
Okay, and I appreciate that because, you know, my hearing is not very good. I used to work in a lumber mill, and so I didn't hear it all, and my sight's not too good. So I appreciate you clarifying that for me. Okay, and then also I wanted to ask the commission to deny. They want to amend the right of way, and I think that was just brought up to you guys, and either we'd like to stay that, you know, for another meeting, or deny it today, because it's unclear to us what that really means, and it's kind of a last-minute deal. So I would like to ask the commission for that, either to stay it. I mean, can we do a show of hands right now? No, you guys don't do that? Okay. Anyway, that was my testimony. I appreciate you guys taking the time, and thank you very much.
Thank you, John, for coming and testifying today. Next is Kelly Bartholomew. Please identify yourself and then your area of residence, and you will have 3 minutes. Thank you for coming this morning.
Good morning. My name's Kelly Bartholomew. I'm a member of Save Stafford Road. I live on Stafford Road, and I have attended all of the planning meetings that were open to the public, and I appreciate their diligent effort. They had quite a lot of hours involved. And so I'm generally in support of the proposed amendments by the Planning Committee. I was wondering if Jennifer, if you would be able to clarify the definition change of right-of-way, which was the very last slide you put up. Could you please explain what that means?
Do you like me to respond?
You can use your 3 minutes, and we can make sure to come back to that question, but I don't want to eat up all your time with her answering your
Okay,
question.
because my reading of that is that I know they were trying to eliminate, you know, say PGE wants to do a line down a road, and they're mostly in their right-of-way, but so several houses along the way, they have to cross through, but if it's But if that's continuous along that line, then it's still within the right-of-way. So the definition change to me, I was unclear whether that meant that private property is now within the right-of-way. I also wanted to reiterate the comprehensive plan for Stafford County, or for Clackamas County, which is 5.1, the comprehensive plan. There are 24 designated scenic roads in Clackamas County. Stafford Road is one of them. The requirements are that the road remain safe and attractive for all users, protection of values, scenic features, open, uncluttered character along designated scenic roads, strict access control to new development, design review requiring scenic roads shall have visual characteristics appropriate to the setting. So Stafford Road is designated as one of these, and the Stafford Road is also part of the Farmlandia Farm Loop, which is a group of farm loops around the county, and in which a lot of people from Portland come to visit the rural farms for the rural farm experience. Well, this will significantly change the character of this area. I don't know what the impact would be on local farmers, but if I lived in Portland, I wouldn't want to come down a road with 100-foot power lines and chop down trees. I don't think that would be a great rural experience. So I think this project is not consistent with that. So if the definition, I just wish that you guys would look at the comprehensive plan of Clackamas County in considering this amendment. And then also, I'd like to understand better the definition of right-of-way.
Ms. Bartholomew, thank you so much for your testimony. We really appreciate it. And when it's appropriate, maybe we can jot that down as a question we can answer, and we will try to do that in today's meeting and make sure those questions are answered when we're done with the rest of everybody else's testimony. But we will get to that question. Thank you again. Ed Wagner, Mr. Wagner, you are up. Please identify yourself, your area of residence, and Mr. Wagner, you will have 3 minutes.
Thank you. Ed Wagner, Stafford Road. I'm Vice President of Safe Stafford Road Organization. That we have 50 homeowners officially on our organization and another 50 in the community that are in severe, vehement opposition to these lines, period. I do want to commend the Planning Commission. They spent a lot of time analyzing, considering the ZDO 288, and we do support it as written, with the exception that we have no idea this new description of the right-of-way, and we're very concerned about that, as was previously mentioned. I'd also like to say that I've not been contacted. I am the main communication conduit for our organization. I haven't spoke with anyone from PG since May of last year on this. Probably none of this would have even come about had PGE decided to put transmission lines in normal height poles. We've spoken to 3 different utility experts. They all have no understanding as to why these are 100-foot steel poles. Everywhere up from California to Washington, transmission lines are typically 60, 65 feet. There may be a logical reason. We've asked the question a number of times. We never get an answer. Basically, the reason that there's easement requirements, as we understand it, is because these 100-foot steel poles, as you might imagine, needs a lot more support. So they have to go in, they have to excavate, they have to pour big concrete blocks so they can attach the poles to that. Had the original design been for 60, 65-foot either steel or wood poles that would not require ostensibly easement requirements, this may have never come to a head. And I'm very upset, with PG has just been non-communicative. I don't care how many times the county or the PUC stipulates that PG says they've been in constant communication with the homeowners. It's nonsense. The only time they'll answer the phone is if you say we're ready to negotiate for the easement. So we feel that they've acted in bad faith the whole time. And even our experience at the PUC yesterday just amplified our discouragement with how we're being treated as a community. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your testimony. Do I have any more blue, can we check, see, did any blue cards pop in while we were doing we didn't see any? If we don't have any, Caroline, we'll move to online testimony, all right, the testimony on Zoom. Nothing left? Okay. Thank you for checking. Caroline, can we moderate, can we see if we have anybody on Zoom? Do we have some people? Okay. So now we're going to take public testimony from online. Each of those that are online waiting to testify, they'll have 3 minutes, and Caroline will allow you to kind of moderate that participation. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chair West. If you would like to testify, please use the raise hand feature, and I will call you in the order in which it was received. I don't see any raised hands at the
Okay.
moment.
So that's the end of our list here. Okay.
Actually, sorry, excuse me.
We do?
We do. We have now Rep. Jules Walters has raised their hand, and they will have 5 minutes. So let me
Perfect.
just adjust here.
Thank you, Rep. Walters.
So please state your name and area of residence, and you will have 5 minutes. Just give me a moment, and I will give you the ability to speak. Go ahead.
Good morning. This is Representative Jules Walters. I reside in West Lynn, and I attended the Stafford Hamlet meeting last night and heard the concerns of the residents about feeling like there hasn't been enough public involvement in the process. And so I just wanted to share with the commission, and thank you so much for your hard work, how important public participation in land use decisions is, as you know, and so I hope that we can move forward in that spirit. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Representative. We appreciate your participation. And I believe this is actually in your district. Am I correct? Yes. Yeah, thank you. Is that the end of our?
We have one more person. Their name is Marlene Reiser. I will allow you to speak, and you will have 3 minutes. 1 second. Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. My name is Marlene Reiser. I'm a member of the Save Stafford Road organization as well. And I live on Stafford Road. And I would just like to reiterate with what Ed and Kelly have said about PGE's, I guess, underhanded ways of handling this. I was listening to the PUC meeting last night, and they needed the waiver for this water treatment plant that none of us have ever heard about. I hadn't heard about it until last night. And it makes me wonder, where this is all going. They've been underhanded from the beginning. They seem to be steamrolling everyone. And the landowners don't have a chance. I think at this point, you need to hire some legal counsel in order to protect your land values and your safety. And, I guess that's what I want to say is PGE has not been forthcoming about any of it. Thank you for your time.
That is the end of my list.
Perfect. So seeing that there's no further testimony, I will now close the hearing for public testimony. So we have some commissioners wanting to speak. So we will now move on to comments and deliberation here by the commissioners. And I will start with Commissioner Scholl.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, everybody, for coming today. Okay, I'd like to appreciate starting with what are the major changes between the existing definition of right-of-way and the new proposed definition?
So, and I may have Mr. Hugel help with this as well, but there has been a proposal to change the definition of right-of-way. It's been part of this package since the beginning. So our current definition of right-of-way is, for want of a better word, vague, and it's probably been in the code for 60 years. And so the idea was, if we're going to regulate utilities differently inside and outside the right-of-way, we better have a definition of right-of-way that makes some sense. And so that was the reason that we proposed a change in the first place. And we just basically researched what are sort of legal definitions of right-of-way. And the draft that had been out there up until the last week or so kind of included about half of what I think it's Black's Law Dictionary would say right-of-way means. And it kind of got at the concept, sort of the legal concept of right-of-way, but didn't really refer to that right-of-way is in fact a physical strip of land. And so I asked Caleb to look at our draft. He's our land use counsel, and he suggested that we add, so that it's clear we're talking about a physical place that right-of-way, actually exists on the ground. So it's reflective of legal dictionary. It's not anything we came up with on our own.
Okay, thank you. Next question. As our county grows and the need for more capability on our utilities increases, should the recommended changes to ZDO 288 be approved in the future, if a utility, particularly natural gas or electricity, needs to increase a facility, the capacity of it, and if that new project is larger, more visible than before, and that project is done completely within the existing utilities right away, would that require any conditional use permit or public hearing?
As recommended by the Planning Commission, no, because they wouldn't need to, they already own or control the property, because there's an existing easement in your example.
Okay, regardless of the scope of the project?
That's correct.
Okay.
If it's a line. If they were going to build a substation, it would still need.
I
Yes.
understand that, yeah.
Yes,
Okay.
correct.
Okay, third question is, if a utility has an existing right-of-way, and in the future, that utility would like to build a new project or increase the scope of an existing project, could that utility increase the right-of-way? In other words, buy an easement from a property owner in consideration of a potential future project without a conditional use permit or public process?
Yes, and I don't want to get too technical on all these different terms, right? Because right-of-way isn't quite the same thing as an easement, but as recommended, but it sort of is.
Well,
There's overlap, but yes, they could go get it first.
Okay.
They could go negotiate it
where
first.
I'm going here is, could they expand the right-of-way by individual agreements with property owners to expand that right-of-way before coming back to the county for a potential future conditional use permit?
Yes, they could go negotiate an easement. That's what it would be with the private property owner. It wouldn't really be increasing the road right-of-way, but they would go negotiate an easement separately with an individual property owner and then propose a facility, and at that point, it would not require a conditional use. So if all the owners consent, for example, with the Stafford project, if every owner who they needed property from said yes, there would be no conditional use permit required.
But if one property owner, let's say, for example, I want to increase my natural gas line, and I need to widen, I need more space on my right-of-way. If I'm running it for 20 miles and there's one property owner who says, no, I'm not going to sell you an easement, then that would trigger a conditional use permit, correct?
It would trigger a conditional use permit, and this is one of the implementation challenges, I think, is that it's not entirely clear from the Planning Commission's recommendation. Does that mean the whole line? As they moved in their meeting, I think you would need a conditional use permit for that stretch, whether it's 10 feet or one power pole, and it really wouldn't technically be the entire line that you would be reviewing, but it would require a conditional use permit.
And a
So,
public hearing,
yes.
and the potential for the public to weigh in on it.
Correct. If it's a new facility, yes. If it's a modification, they might do a non-conforming use alteration, which is a little different, but still requires public participation and notice and the
Okay.
opportunity to appeal. Yes.
Okay. One last question, please. Now, this change to the ZDO 288 is not Stafford-specific. We're trying to streamline our process here in the county to make it actually more cost-effective, more efficient for utilities by not having to get a permit inside the right-of-ways along our roads, for example. My question is, in the case, as just an example, because the glaring example we have right now on this, that I'm sure we'll see more in the future, is a Stafford example. So with the Stafford example, if the board approved your recommended changes to ZDO 288, would PGE need to apply for a conditional use permit to execute their planned improvements on the Tonquin project?
So it's my understanding, yes. They have indicated to us that they have some areas where they need to condemn property. They have filed with the PUC to start that condemnation process. So to the extent that they're not able to successfully negotiate those remaining areas of the line, they would need a conditional use permit. I guess I have to throw out there, they could conceivably redesign. I don't know how much flexibility they have to do this differently. Maybe they can move a few things or change a few things, and if it all of a sudden, all of it is in the right-of-way or an existing easement, then they would not need a conditional use permit. So there isn't any way for me to tell you for sure this project will need one. What I can tell you is that as the design has been explained to me to date, yes, they would need a conditional use permit.
Okay.
Or an
That-
alteration of a non-conforming use. I have to keep saying that because in point of fact, PGE has filed an application as of last Thursday for an alteration of a non-conforming use because the line is so old. So it's another option available to them, but for our purposes here, it's still land use review.
Okay, that's all my questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Scholl. Just because I know there's been a lot of questions from the audience and then around this definition piece, do we have the ability to read that and to be clear with that?
Sure.
I think that is a big question that needs to be answered. So if you could
Sure.
could help us understand that would be
Sure.
great.
What the definition that was on the slide says is the legal right established by usage or grant to pass through property owned by another or the strip of land subject to a non-owner's right to pass through. And I think there was, an implication that maybe the intent of this definition change was to somehow, by definition, create additional right-of-way out there on Stafford, by changing the term, and that is certainly not the intent. Our understanding of this definition is that right-of-way would apply to Stafford Road, which is wider than the pavement, but it's the area that's within that, what the code amendments say is within the road right-of-way. So it would be about, if Stafford Road right-of-way is 60 feet wide, then anything within that would not require a conditional use. In addition, it's fairly typical that there are public utility, not always, but fairly typical that there are public utility easements outside the right-of-way. Anything within that would not require a conditional use, as drafted currently, as recommended by the Planning Commission.
Thank you.
You bet.
Commissioner Savas, you're up.
Well, based on that last clarification, I'm going to shift my order of, number one, questions and comments, and just to keep this conversation going. So, Jennifer, could you please give me a definition or distinction between the right-of-way and an easement?
I probably can't unless I look at the code, or maybe Caleb can. Because it does get a little bit convoluted in the sense that road rights-of-way kind of are easements in most cases, but I still think there's a legal distinction between the two. So maybe I'll turn to Caleb and see. But I can also look up our definition of easement.
I think an easement and right-of-way are sometimes interchangeably used. In this case, we clarify in the text of the amendments that a conditional use permit would be required unless it's within the road right-of-way. So we are clarifying which right-of-way we're talking about in the text of the amendments.
Right. Okay. I know we kind of talked about this a little bit last time we had a discussion about this, and I know that on, was it March 15th, I think, when PG was here for that. It wasn't a hearing, but it was a discussion we had. I forgot the gentleman's name from PG, who was a representative, but I did ask the question, or teased out, maybe I didn't ask a question, but what I learned from that was that PG was going to go through this conditional use process and these amendments or this ZDO was not going to be a factor because they were going to take the conditional use permit process anyhow. So therefore, if that is still true today, then I'm just wondering perhaps maybe what has changed, if there is a change. But if it's true, then that gives me a better understanding. And I want to switch to now saying that to Commissioner Schultz's question I thought was interesting about if you have an existing right-of-way for a utility and you want to increase it, I think my issue or point I want to really expand here or amplify is I think there's a big difference in definition between maybe utility for local use and then maybe transmission or something of large scale. So let's just say that there's a small gas line that's feeding a community and someone wants to expand that to make that interstate transmission line, and now they're going to put a 48-inch line. I think there's a big difference, perhaps. I'm not challenging my colleague at all, but I just think that that's my point here is that this is about scale. So I think the definition of utility can also be evaluated in this context about what's the difference between local utility for a local community versus something that is either interstate or of such scale that it is significant. And I believe that, whether I'm a county commissioner or whether I'm a citizen of Clackamas County or frankly a citizen of the state, I really think that those large lines, those large transmissions that are not necessarily for local use, there's some tangible aspect of that, but when they're of that scale, I think it's historically always been a challenge, whether you're looking at pipelines, whether it's North Dakota or the Alaska pipeline, or there's a lot of examples where these large-scale projects have a significant impact, whether it's, for natural resources or property owners or whatnot. So in this instance, I think scale is the bigger issue for me. And I believe, I think I said this before, but I just want to restate it, I believe these larger scale projects that are not for local use, I think should be, and perhaps where we agree, maybe not completely, I agree with the Planning Commission's recommendation, but I do agree with a lot of it from that sense. And maybe they almost got there. At the very minimum, if the Planning Commission's recommendation goes forward, I do have one edit I would like to make, and that is where it says natural gas lines. I would like to take that word natural out and say any, or basically gas lines, so that if hydrogen does come down the pike, that we don't have to redo this again, or we're not being mindful of perhaps there could be a day where hydrogen is now going down our roads. One other question I have, and I'm going to switch to some more comments, but another question I had is one of the folks here spoke about the scenic road distinction. Is there any relevance to this whatsoever? What would be relevant?
So again, yes, Stafford Road is designated as a scenic road, so are a number of other routes around the county. There are various comprehensive plan policies that apply to scenic roads. In the context of a conditional use permit, yeah, that could be significant because there's a requirement that a proposal for a conditional use be consistent with the applicable policies of the comprehensive plan. So if somebody's proposing a conditional use permit for a transmission line on a scenic road, arguably, it won't meet that policy, and it could be grounds for denial of the conditional use. Or at least modification of it in some way to make it more, more consistent. The comp plan policies currently that relate to undergrounding of utility lines don't specify, and there's a bunch of them, it's not just on scenic roads, we have them scattered throughout the comp plan. And they just say utility lines. And so one proposal here today, before you today, is to clarify and say that that only applies to service lines, that we're not mandating that transmission and distribution lines be underground. So to the extent that the board has concerns about that, you might not want to change that policy for scenic roads. That may have some impacts, in terms of if there isn't an alternate route available, then what do we do? But I just want to at least put that out there, that there is a comp plan policy related to scenic roads that talks about underground utilities. And so,
So I maybe took a couple things out there, maybe I need some help with better understanding. So scenic does have a designation. Is it only relevant for conditional use applications or not?
Comp plan policies apply to zone changes, and they apply to conditional use permits, and they apply to variances, and that is all. Otherwise, it's only, you're just applying the zoning code. So fairly narrow. So if somebody's doing like a non-conforming use alteration to an existing line, the comp plan policies do not apply.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to comment, and that is that I definitely see the need for streamlining and for whether you're developing or it's the county staff, spending a lot of time. I do think there is a rationale for making our process more streamlined and not creating a lot of work, which comes out to expense and delays for projects and so forth. So I can see that there needs to be some streamlining. And again, I think for the local utilities, for local use, in that definition, I'm okay with a lot of that. However, again, when it comes to scale of larger stuff, again, I think that's where, as state, whether I'm a resident of the state or resident of the county, or I'm sitting here in my capacity I am today as a county commissioner, I really think that the conditional use ought to be in place in order for us to factor in things that have, whether it's aesthetics or whether it's a quality of life issue or whatever it may be for these large capacity transmission lines. That's what I think the distinction is. That's really not really spelled out or really clear here. So I see both sides of this argument to a degree. I just think about, if would Clackamas County, first, let's just say a transmission line had to run somewhere north and south down the state of Oregon, would Clackamas County want to have a interstate transmission line run through its county? What benefit would be of the county unless there's a numerical, lease on the land or something like that? I would say probably no one would really want that in their backyard, right? And I don't think that Clackamas County, as gorgeous and beautiful as our county is, I don't want to be checkered with something super large. I'm not saying this is of that scale, but I think some people would say, yes, it is of that scale. So I'm not here to argue that, but I do think that that is where I somewhat agree with a lot of the Planning Commission's recommendation that's before us today, with the strikeout of the word natural before gas, just leave maybe just gas lines in general, and willing to hear what my other colleagues feel, and I might have another comment or two along the way. So I'll yield the floor.
Terrific. Commissioner Schrader, you are up.
Yeah, I'm just trying to clarify in my own head because this is pretty complex. So the line we're talking about is lines, are transmission lines. Are they also being used, this might be a PGE question though, are they also used for local transmission of electricity to the surrounding community or communities?
In the Stafford example, is the question? My understanding, and PGE can certainly correct me, is that these poles will have both distribution and transmission lines. They currently out there on Stafford have distribution lines.
Okay, and that's what the issue is my colleague just mentioned, is that the transmission lines, even though it will have both, have a different impact particularly with view sheds that we're
Taller
talking
poles,
about.
larger poles, higher
Yep.
voltage, yes.
Yeah. So my other question is, I just want to make sure I'm understanding this. So if I appear a little dull on this issue, forgive me. So what I am understanding is that these larger transmission lines, there has to be other land other than the right-of-way in order to accommodate building them. Is that correct?
I think it would depend on what the existing easements are, but in the Stafford example, what I understand is that PGE will need to acquire some additional easements
Okay.
beyond what already exists.
Right, and
But
that's,
whether every line would require that, it depends.
no, but that is what I
Yes.
think the crux of the issue is here, as I'm seeing it, is that there has to be the acquisition. And what we're talking about is those pieces would be under the rubric of a conditional use. Would that be?
That is what the Planning Commission has suggested to you.
Right.
Correct. There are certainly other options, but
Okay.
yes.
So, but my third clarification is this. You know, the Public Utility Commission has a great deal of authority. Is there a possibility that, given what we're seeing as the need for transmission as well as delivery on PGE's part, are they able to go to the Public Utility Commission and initiate condemnation proceedings?
They have already done that. They've filed for what's called a certificate of public necessity and convenience, which is the prerequisite. They have to get that from the PUC before they can then go, I guess, to court to actually
All right.
condemn. Yes.
Okay, I just wanted to clarify that, because even if we move ahead with the recommendation of the Planning Commission, and we require areas that are not in the right-of-way to go through a conditional use process, the potential is to trigger another process that would be out of our purview. Is that accurate?
So the condemnation part itself for the utility is out of our purview. The county doesn't have any involvement in the Condemnation
Okay.
Act for a utility. But what we've been told, what staff's been told, and again, I mean, I want to be careful about not overcommitting like what we can guarantee, but
Right.
my understanding is that the PUC looks at the local land use requirements and wants to know whether the utility has actually gotten whatever they need from the local government to show that they can practically build this project before they issue the certificate. So I think that, yes, PGE, for example, would have to come to us for their land use permit first. But we don't control the PUC process, and, you know, there could certainly be arguments made or things could happen, so I can't promise that that's the sequence, but that's my understanding of how it works.
So even if we did not give them a condition of approval, that PUC process can still move forward? Or it's taken, or I guess what I'm trying to say is it's taken into consideration by the PUC as a land use piece.
Correct.
But they, since we have no purview, they could also weigh the larger necessity and need. I mean, it would weigh into their decision, but it wouldn't necessarily.
I'm happy to follow up with you regarding what exactly PUC looks for, because on the one hand, they may take land use, what the county has approved or what it is likely to approve, into consideration. On the other hand, our code requires that in order to initiate a land use application, you own the property. And if PGE can't own the property until it goes through the PUC, and PUC needs land use approved, needs to know if we've approved the land use before they will do that. And to
Okay.
get land use approval, they need to own the property, then we're in a big, circle here. I can follow up with you after I've done a little bit more research.
Yeah, I'm just trying to figure out what the roles are with this and how significant our land use changes will affect an additional process that I suspect will move forward one way or the other anyway. So
Well,
let's
and
follow up on that.
Yeah, I think you
or
always
potentially
have,
move forward.
there's certain projects that may be supersided. So I think Commissioner Savas talked about like interstate natural gas lines. As far as I understand, those are federally regulated. I don't think we get to say whether they happen or they don't happen. That's my understanding. So certain facilities, if BPA wants to run, I don't think we can tell them no. So there's going to be some stuff that we may just be preempted from. But one way, if you want to be able to evaluate these impacts of these larger facilities, is not to worry about condemnation versus not condemnation or easement. Just decide that transmission lines require a conditional use permit, and that would be more straightforward, I guess. And then we don't get into this, well, but what if their lawyer successfully argues over, just require it. And then if we end up being preempted, we can't control that. But anyway, that's just a thought of how you might.
Yeah, and what I'm trying to say is that this is going to be more complicated, I suspect.
Yes.
Over and above our particular land use issue. That's what I'm suspecting. I do think, I see what Commissioner, just to move on to just one last point. I do see, Commissioner, what you're talking about in terms of the scale and size of transmission. But it is also going to be used for local use too. I think we have to at least acknowledge that that's part of it. And again, what are the economic implications in terms of power delivery systems, not just for our local community, but regionally, that is something else that I think that we need to at least think about. Thank you. That's all I have.
Thank you, Commissioner. Caroline, do we have Chair Smith?
Yes, she has her hand raised.
Thank you.
Welcome, everybody. I'm listening to this conversation. It's been very interesting of what I expected. Commissioner Savas, I have no problem changing natural gas to gas lines. That's totally fine. I think we're getting hung up on a couple things here. I want to go back and discuss the definition of right-of-way for a minute. Now, we changed the definition of right-of-way for an update to make us more better, correct? So we're not in the past and having people challenge us to the use of right-of-way. Is that correct, Caleb?
Could you repeat the last part of the question? In the past, have people challenged?
Well, we have not been challenged in the past on the use of our definition of right-of-way, correct?
Correct. These are clarifying amendments, not in response to any challenges.
Not to what?
Not in response to any challenges.
Okay. And so the clarifying definition of right-of-way should help define for what anybody wants to do on a utility and to help define when a landowner is giving a right-of-way to their land away, what that means. Is that correct?
The definition of right-of-way is being refined to more clearly indicate when a conditional use permit is and is not required for these utility facilities. A property owner wouldn't give right-of-way to a utility facility to accommodate their project. They would grant them a limited easement, which might be right next to the right-of-way to allow for a larger line or something like that.
So on further definition, you're saying this new definition of right-of-way enhances the conditional use permitting process.
It makes it more clear.
Okay, I'm okay with that. Now, the conditional use process is used as a factor in development, correct? Because Commissioner Savas brought up these very large projects would have to go through a conditional use permit process. And help me understand. Let's say that any utility wants to build a project that has not been built before in size and scope, for instance, what PGE wants to do at Stafford. So if PGE is condemning land outside of the right-of-way, they will have to go through the conditional use process. correct?
If it's outside the right-of-way and outside of an easement that PGE holds or land that PGE owns, then yes, it would require a conditional use permit.
And then what
Or
happens
alteration of a
during that
non-conforming
commission-
use.
Okay, and then what happens during that conditional use process? PGE or any utility brings forth specifications on what they want to do, and then a whole analysis, I assume, is done by our planning department, and then it goes to the hearings officer, I assume, and if it's appealed, correct?
It goes directly to the hearings officer if it's a conditional use, and there's just a staff report, and then the hearings officer makes the decision, and that's appealable to LUBA.
Okay, and so if somebody agrees with it, they can show up with the land hearings officer hearing, along with the utility, to say yay or nay, we like this, we don't like this, and then that's where the standards are applied or not applied, correct?
For a conditional use, yes, that's correct.
Okay, I'm fine with it, thank you.
Commissioner Mark Scholl.
Yes, I just have a couple more quick questions. Thank you, Jennifer, for your endurance this morning. Okay, so how is the ZDO 288 changes, how will they actually play out in practice? And, you know, when we think about property rights, which is something that's very important to me, what's the actual power of the people in the community to shape their future if the ZDO is changed? As an example, on the east end of the county, we have a government project being planned, and that government, it's not Clackamas County, but that government, I understand, is paying about $1.5 million a month in legal costs. The CPO, who is fighting the project, the people of the land, have contracted an attorney, and the CPO, the residents of the area, they're working hard as they can to scrape together a few tens of thousands of dollars for their legal fight. So, you know, we got this picture of government, powerful, well-funded, and the people struggling to assert themselves in their community, to protect their homes, their property values. So that's kind of a big picture I see. I'm not talking about Stafford now necessarily, but this is happening many places in the state. So this morning, yesterday, the day before, I got a letter here from the chair, Randall Yamada from the Stafford Tualatin Valley CPO, spoke this morning. He says, I quote, "In relation to the PGE Stafford Road project, the Hamlet and the CPO unanimously support the Planning Commission's 5-2 vote requiring a conditional use permit." So the recommended changes to ZDO 288 are sensitive to the Planning Commission's recommendations, correct?
So the proposal that you have before you today is the Planning Commission's
Yes,
recommendation?
okay.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think that's very important. That's very significant to me. Okay, so my question is this. Okay, in practical application of the proposed changes to ZDO 288, if we receive a conditional use application, what are the criteria going to be for reviewing that application and determining either approval or denial? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
I can tell you a little bit about them. There are 5. Do we actually have them? Oh, look at that, Caleb. So the straightforward, it has to be a conditional use in the zone, which obviously that's what you'd be establishing. So we are looking at the characteristics of the subject property. So that's where they actually want to put the facility, where the line would go. Are the characteristics of that property suitable for the use? Then there's a question about transportation, which normally for a utility line, they don't they're not generating traffic trips, so that's really more about congestion and that kind of thing. But there's a safety element, so if they were proposing something that was going to cause an unsafe situation on a roadway, that could be considered. And then the proposed use will not alter the character of the surrounding area in a manner that substantially limits, impairs, or precludes the use of surrounding properties. So it sounds pretty broad, but I can tell you it's a relatively high bar. I mean, in terms of how that's been worked out through past decisions. It's not that there can't be any impacts on neighboring properties. It substantially limits, impairs, or precludes the use of surrounding properties. And then it's comprehensive plan compliance, which we talked about with the scenic, like as an example, the scenic road policies or any other comprehensive plan policies that might apply.
Okay, thank you. And I have just one final question today, and that is, I can foresee that in just about any conditional use application, you've got a utility and you've got a community.
Mm-hmm.
Many times they're not going to be on the same sheet of music. So the decision on the conditional use application is going to favor one side and perhaps not the other. So either the utility or the community, they're going to appeal to the Public Utility Commission, potentially. Is
Not
that
for
correct?
land use. They would appeal to the Land Use Board of Appeals.
The Land Use Board of LUBA. Okay,
Yes,
thank you.
correct.
Okay, LUBA.
Yep.
Okay, so it goes to LUBA, and then after LUBA, if the side that petitioned LUBA doesn't get the outcome they want, then it goes to the Oregon Court of Appeals. If it doesn't happen there for them, it goes to the Oregon Supreme Court, and then at the end of that, it's game over, right?
I mean, obviously, they can opt out at any point in this process and not keep pursuing appeals. But yes, they would go to the Court of Appeals, and then they can appeal to the Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court does not have to take it. and
Yes, I
authors don't.
understand that. Okay.
So, yes.
Okay, well, thank you. I appreciate that.
Thank you, Commissioner Scholl. Commissioner Savas, and then I will do my comments.
Okay, thank you. So I just want to qualify with something else. I was just thinking about over all these years, 25 plus years of public service, and my first elected position in 2001, the first thing before us was a cell tower, and that was a visual sightly thing in this particular neighborhood. Had issues with land use impacts or impacts for projects, whether it's airports, sewage treatment plants, water treatment plants. This is something that we always wrangle with one way or another, so it's part of our business. So there's nothing, I won't say nothing extraordinary about this other than, for me, this transmission element versus distribution. So with that said, as I interpret this, and in my conversation with staff along the way here, I mentioned earlier that I have a little bit of discomfort with the Planning Commission recommendation because help me if I'm wrong here, but my understanding is that the reliance upon or the situation in which conditional use applies really is where land outside the right-of-way is condemned. I think we made that clear, right? Versus transmission versus distribution. And that, you're nodding your head up and down, so that's my understanding.
Yes.
That's what I think I would like to see a change in the Planning Commission recommendation. Is that an easy fix, Jennifer?
Yes.
Okay, and how would you change that, or where would you change that?
Well, in about, 40 different places in this packet, just because we link to every zone we have. So it would be a series of, I'll call them minor amendments that we would make to what you have in front of you today that we would bring back for adoption. But in terms of, it is an easy fix to make from my perspective. We can draft that. It's not complex. And I think, that can be done.
I could do that, I would just maybe ask yourself and council how you would craft the motion that we could make that would
Right.
recognize the
Right.
amendment to take out the word natural for gas and the amendment that would make that distinction between distribution and more transmission.
And to clarify, so if I understand what you're saying, you're suggesting that rather than draw the distinction between what type of line does and doesn't require a conditional use based upon the condemnation piece, instead it would be based upon the type of line. In other words, transmission, whatever you decide. Is that correct?
Well, and/or.
Okay.
Can it be both?
It can be any, yeah, sure. I mean, I think the question that I have, and I'll just pose this, presumably you want a conditional use permit because it's got impacts. The utility line is going to have some impacts that you want the community to be able to weigh in on. And the question in my mind is, are the impacts of the utility line related to whether there's condemnation or not? The utility line looks and functions the same way. On that individual property owner, sure, because they're giving up some property rights. But the line functions and looks the same way, whether it's in the right-of-way, in the easement, in a newly condemned area, it's the same facility. And that's where I'm not sure from a land use standpoint that the condemnation is what it should turn on. If you're worried about the larger scale projects, then it would be natural gas and electric transmission lines. Potentially, I don't know if you're worried about distribution lines. Those are the ones that are out in Stafford now. I mean, they still can be, they're still poles, but they're not quite as high and the voltage isn't as high and et cetera. So if that's what you're interested in, we can make those changes. And I think it would be a matter of moving for the Planning Commission recommendation with modifications. And the modifications, as you've described them, could be to eliminate the reference to whether it's on property owned or controlled by the utility or in the right-of-way or whatever, and simply state that, for example, gas and electric transmission lines would require a conditional use permit.
Yeah, just to thank you for that. That's my understanding is correct. I just want to just state that it just seems more logical, practical to have it hinge on that transmission versus distribution rather than whether or not a property has to be condemned. I think it's just logical to me. And I think it's defensible as well as far as a decision that may prevent us from a challenge, right, to just get it across the finish line. I don't know if my colleagues understand. I want to make sure, that if there's any questions about that detail, but that would be the motion I would like to make in order to support this today.
Thank you, Commissioner Savas. Share my thoughts and maybe questions that I have. This is a complicated issue with, I think, two very valid competing forces here. I did a ride-along this week with PGE looking at that, and I live over in that area. Like, this is just right outside Wilsonville. Drive it all the time, know it well. And it's a beautiful area, and I'm glad it's in our county. It's quite precious. Also, understanding some of the things we love about Clackamas County is that people want to live in this county in Oregon. 6 of the fastest growing cities out of the top 10 fastest growing cities in Oregon, 6 of them are in Clackamas County. A number of them are real close to here. And that we also have a housing crisis, legitimately have a housing crisis. I applaud the governor for her ambitious goals to help deal with infrastructure issues and get housing online. I don't know if we can meet those ambitious numbers. There's a lot of barriers in the way. I look at people like my son that wants to get into the trades and people that want to open up their business in Clackamas County, and we want more industrial lines, and everybody's got to have a car charger in their new home. These realities and policy decisions that have already been made for us have real impacts. Transmission lines are one of them. We are going to have transmission lines. I also want to protect the property rights and the concerns of the constituents that live there, that have lived there for generations, many of them, their families have, and making sure that that very unique, pristine part of the county is cherished and honored and valued. And where's that balance today is what we're wrestling with, and we're getting into the weeds with it. One question I have, it does feel like that this essential utility, just like gas is, just like water is, just like sewer is being treated differently now than the other essential utilities that bring us lights, that bring power to hospitals in the area. There's a hospital, Meridian Park is right there in Clackamas County. It's a great hospital, by the way. I can attest to that as a nurse in the field. It's a great place. They do good work there. It is essential to modern life that we all live today. And to all these things we want to see happen in Oregon. What if somehow we got a chips plant over here or industry to help support that? Do we have the power necessary to bring those billions to help people have economic prosperity, climb the economic ladder? Do we have those resources right now? It's interesting when you drive through it, just seeing it painted a clear picture for me. You get up to Yesteryear Farms. They have 70-ish foot wood poles that are similar-ish to what we're talking about here, not wood versus steel. Then you start to go up that Stafford area, and mostly distribution lines there, not quite as tall, maybe 40 feet, half the size. But then you start to get up by Borland again, and there's the big transmission lines again. It's a small little area within Clackamas County that is already kind of bordered by these transmission poles that we're talking about. It's a unique question before us. I am curious, when we look at counties, as you know, I'm Commissioner Savas and Commissioner Schrader, I know you know, especially with Association of Oregon Counties and whatnot, and NACO. How is this policy or land use thing before us really compared to other counties and how they handle this issue? This cannot just be unique to us, and to have continuity of utility services. It crosses jurisdictions, and there has to be some type of collaboration or fairness or an ability to get these services throughout Oregon. How do we, in this policy, now compare to Washington County, Marion County, Yamhill, Multnomah County, or anywhere else in the state? Is this a best practice, what we're about to do, or is this us being uniquely different?
I could guess, and I can tell you what I did do, which was reach out to Washington County, and we may have some other information we can get you, but Washington County has an exemption in their code for in the right-of-way. And their principal planner said, and we're overdue for an update, just generally, because I think what you would find is that a lot of jurisdictions have the circumstance we have where their code says something, but it isn't necessarily what's been happening all these years, because just because it says utility facility doesn't mean anybody ever thought that meant every underground sewer line in the county, you know? So I did send something out to all the county planning directors, and I got not much response back. It's one of those, sometimes people have time to answer to see, but we have not done a check of everybody's codes to find out. I can just tell you that that's what the planner in Washington County told me.
Okay. Some of this might be a state legislative fix that's going to be beyond Clackamas County, that the legislature needs to weigh on it. It looks like Rep. Walters in this area is acutely aware of this situation also, and maybe this has to do with some policy decisions, once again, that are going to be much larger than Clackamas County. We already talked about other entities here today and other governmental bodies that will have to be appealed to. We've heard LUBA, we've heard the PUD, we've heard the state legislature. And so our role in this is relatively limited. I am, over this last week, a little bit wrestling with the very real concern that my grandkids and my son's generation need to have this infrastructure for a better, more prosperous Oregon, with the legacy we have with protecting pristine natural areas, and where is that balance? I know a number of the landowners that live on this stretch of area, this road, have already made a deal with PGE and have a little bit different perspective than some of the landowners before us. It is not a unanimous thing even within that area. Many people are weighing this out. If I sit here today, I actually don't totally know where my vote's going to go as I weigh those two big questions before me, because that's kind of what we're talking about here. And I think Clackamas County is trying to find that good local balance with the work of the Planning Commission. yeah, I can just like, I can feel the pressure in my brain right now, just like, as I weigh these things out. I guess I'll leave it at that. Looks like we have a couple more lights up, but that's what's weighing on me right now with everybody in the audience, and what's going on is how we do this is making sure that, the constituents that we represented, their voices are heard and we make the best decision, but we also represent every area of the hamlet, the Stafford area, in Clackamas County outside of this couple miles that already have these transmission lines. Some of these poles are from 1942. They're from just past the Second World War. And they're all being updated with steel poles. They're all being, because they're safer, stronger, they don't have the pulling and the bending, they're not gonna collapse in the road. So there is a lot of, some of these upgrades are good and they're doing them as needed as they upgrade. So that's my, that's some of my thoughts there, but I'll go to, looks like Chair Smith has some thoughts.
Yes, thank you, Commissioner West. We talked about the state law applying in ag and forestry zones, but we didn't really say what that state law is. Is it more restrictive or is it just a different process?
Good question.
So in those state-regulated zones, utility lines above ground, below ground, regardless of size, are allowed outright in the right-of-way. And then if they are outside the right-of-way, they require a land use review. It's a different process. It's not a conditional use. It's what's called a utility facility necessary for public service. And so they basically have to demonstrate that the utility line has to be on that resource land in order to provide a necessary service, rather than being able to go somewhere else. So it's really designed to direct utility lines off of farm and forest land if alternatives exist. But they obviously don't always exist, so there's a process. Inside the right-of-way, outright allowed.
Are there any ag forestry lands zoning in the Stafford area?
Yes. The line that we're actually talking about as an example, part of it is zoned exclusive farm use, and so the review process may be either there won't be one for those parts, or if it's outside the right-of-way, it's a different, again, though, they're proposing to do this as a non-conforming use alteration, so that would apply equally, regardless of zone.
Well, you just confused me with your last statement.
Yes.
Jennifer, now, wait a minute. If you have ag or forest zones, a different process applies, but then you said it doesn't if it's a non-conforming use.
Correct. So for a new facility, ag and forest zones are regulated by state law, and their provisions differ from what you're talking about adopting today. For an existing line that was established before zoning requirements were in place, the county and the state apply the same standards to review of what's called an alteration of a non-conforming use. Those standards are uniform regardless of zone.
Okay. I'm pretty muddy on that going forward, but I think I understand it. Regarding Commissioner Savis's desire to set aside transmission lines from distribution lines, I am not sure what that benefit is, Commissioner Savis, but if you could explain that more, I'd appreciate it.
Sure. I'll take a stab at that, and I'll ask actually, either legal counsel or Jennifer Hughes to clarify if I don't do it well enough. And let me just digress a little bit and just say, again, I'm basing a lot of this, I'm trying to thread the needle here. So I'm taking seriously, as I mentioned earlier, PG's comment back in March that they're going through the conditional use process no matter what. So this is not impacting all the things that Commissioner West just spoke about, which are more distribution, right? So the hospitals, our local homes, power to all the things that we need for life support and safety and all those things would happen under distribution. Transmission would be, perhaps interstate, maybe not, but those large capacity lines that don't serve literally are going beyond serving the local distribution area. So let's just say you have a local water plant and the water plants feeding the area. And then the city of Portland wants to sell water to Marion County. Well, they would run a line from hypothetically from Multnomah County and trench through Clackamas County to get to Marion County. That would be transmission, right? That would be a transmission line. Is there a benefit for Clackamas County? Probably not really. That's not the best example, but I think transmission would be those large capacity things that are not distribution. And everything that Commissioner West spoke to, I think that's our job. Our job is to meet the needs of responsibly of all our utilities and everything else. I mean, we're serving the people. Transmission lines don't necessarily do that, but I do recognize there is linkage between making sure we have enough capacity on an interstate level and for the state on the larger scale things to make sure there's capacity to power all our homes in high peak demand needs like winter and or summer when people are running the air conditioners. Does that help, Commissioner Smith, or would you like?
Well, a little bit. A little bit. I'm still unclear on what side I'm going to fall on that particular amendment, Paul, because I'm looking at when it comes to transmission versus distribution lines, I'm looking at efficiency and necessity of need. And so if we're going to hold up the utility because we don't like the size of the transmission lines, when they will be also adding the distribution on the same pole, I'm having trouble going down that road. But I mean, I'm not a hard no on that. I'm just trying to understand.
Yeah, Chair Smith, you're articulating some of the angst that I'm feeling. We do have subject matter experts here. Can anybody from PGE explain the correlation and the intersection between the transmission lines and the distribution lines and what you just heard now? Please come forward, introduce yourself for the record, and let us know how those things work. And sorry about the maintenance we have being done on the building and the background noise it causes.
Hi, yeah. Thanks for the opportunity to speak.
Is your mic on? The little button will go green, and then you'll enter your name and then your position at PGE.
Is that working now?
I think so, yes.
Hi. Yeah, so Dr. Ian Beal, I manage the transmission planning team at Portland General Electric. Yeah, so the question was around sort of distribution versus transmission, and how do we think about that, and what sort of how power gets from generation, right, all the way to your homes. So the general way we think about that is, you have generators. Those can be remote, big hydro units, natural gas, coal, wind, solar, whatever that is. Those generally go over very large transmission lines. Out west, we have, in particular, 500 kilovolt and 230 kilovolt lines. Those are more the lattice towers that you can picture. They're wider, they're taller. Those typically can't get built in road right-of-way. Those land at substations, so there's plenty of local electrical substations here in Clackamas County, and those get stepped down using a transformer to typically 115 kilovolts. 115 kV is what we serve most of our more distribution substations in the area. 115 kV is the proposed line on Stafford Road, for example. So there's 115 kV across much of the county and the greater Portland metro area. That 115 kV goes to more local distribution substations and gets stepped down again we use a 13 kilovolt distribution system here in all our service territory for the most part. And the 13 kilovolts is the distribution lines, for example, like the lines on Stafford Road now. Does that sort of get to the question?
I guess to simplify it, because Doctor, I am no expert in this, and you are. Some of the conversation around these towers, which are bigger and they are primarily transmission versus distribution, do these towers also distribute to the local communities we're talking about? Is there an intersection between the two, or are they just passing through electricity kind of along a highway of lines here and big towers through this community that doesn't necessarily benefit this community directly. So I'm trying to understand the intersection between distribution, transmission, and the very localized benefit.
Understood. Yeah, so absolutely, the 115 does serve the local communities. So again, the proposed line for Stafford Road is going from a substation in Wilsonville to a substation or just north of, I believe it's the Tualatin River there. And so the 115 is needed to bring, bulk electricity to the distribution substation, which is then stepped down to a voltage which can be brought over smaller local lines. But the whole system, the whole contiguous system is required, right? Those really big transmission lines, which aren't really what's being considered, at least in the Stafford Road example, the more local 115 and the distribution lines are all required, right? If you take any of those pieces out, you're not able to take the generation from remote sources and bring it to local communities.
And so these towers that we're talking about right now on Stafford, they are both transmission and distribution.
As of today, they're just distribution.
They're just distribution. No, they will be. The proposed.
Proposes to, yes, overbuild transmission and update the towers, like you said, to more
So
modern
it transmits more electricity, which on the same towers will also have distribution to get to the hospitals, the homes, the car chargers, the solar panels, the whatever else, BioTwist facility in Wilsonville. I mean, these new industries coming in. So I'm just, is that accurate?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you for explaining. I don't know if anybody else had any more questions for him. I needed to have that clarification. I didn't know if, I see lights lit up here, but anything to this expert? Any questions for this expert? Okay, thank you for explaining that. I'm not sure who was first. I'm going to go to Commissioner.
Actually, I had my light on.
I didn't know who.
But I was responding to Commissioner.
Okay, Commissioner Salvas, go ahead.
Yeah, so I just want to.
Thank you.
It's been on for a while. That's all right. So in response to Commissioner West, you're pointing out all those needs, and let's face it, I'm not blind to the fact that, as we electrify more and more and more, and all the mandates that we need more energy delivered to our substations and so forth to make that work. I totally understand that. It's not unlike our freeway system, right? Our highway system. We know we need roads, and there's corridors, and there's arterials, and there's the network that feeds our homes, or the local road network. The question is really, in this case, is alignment, right? Where do you put it, right? If you're to put a freeway in, you need a freeway. Where do you put it, right? And that takes a lot of thought and consideration. But I think, frankly, in this case, again, what PG told us and shared with us was that they do not need this amendment. They are going through the conditional use process anyhow. So I don't see that before us today is a decision whether or not it's going to be built or whether or not we need transmission lines or power. The question is, thinking ahead as commissioners, thinking visionary, what could come to us next? And how do we craft this language to make sure that we have some lever for those large transmission lines? Let's just say it's hydrogen. Let's say, in your lifetime, maybe not mine, maybe I hope maybe mine, hydrogen is a new fuel source, energy source. Those lines, do I want to have a say, or should the county commission or local governments have a say on where they go and don't go? Absolutely, right? If they're large in scale, if they're smaller, like a typical utility, then that's fine. But to me, I think what we're doing today, again, based on what PG told us in March, that we are setting the groundwork, number one, to alleviate unnecessary staff work. We're doing some streamlining here, even with these amendments. And in the rare instances that a transmission line comes up, which is rare, right, then we'll have a conditional use process. So I think by threading that needle that way, we are satisfying all the immediate needs and giving us the opportunity, or future commissions the opportunity in governments to say, hey, this is a big deal, whatever this new transmission line is going to be, and therefore we have some levers to pull in order to make sure that it's done right.
Thank you. Commissioner Scholl.
Yes, well, we don't, you mentioned having a say where they go or don't go. We're talking about utilities that already have right-of-ways, not looking at a future where there's no right-of-way. That's not what we're looking at today. Also, Commissioner Sabas, on your idea to modify the proposed motion, are you talking about requiring a conditional use application for a utility that wants to increase gas flow or add conductors onto an existing facility infrastructure? Or are you talking about requiring a conditional use application only if that transmission line or that gas line is being modified to increase capacity?
Well, guess the word capacity is a.
That's my question.
It's probably capacity no matter how you look at it, to be honest about it. I would say that, Commissioner Schull, that if they want to increase the local distribution line, like a water line, right? More homes, more water's needed. Right. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter because this would apply. So if that question is, could they expand it for local distribution? Absolutely. This won't interfere. It's when it goes from distribution to a different purpose of transmission. That would be the distinction.
It isn't often the county's interest is to make sure that these lines that we're putting are safe, right? That's kind of are safe for local communities. And then beyond that, there's other processes engaged for public comment to engage in. But the county's role, compared to like many other counties, that's the primary role. Is this going to be safe? Is this pole safe? Am I right? Like, well, I see, like, please.
Yes and no.
Yeah.
So the utility permitting process, which is where we're going to give a utility access to our right-of-way. So they're going to put a pole like next to the road. Yes, we have some safety considerations there. You know, they can't put the pole in the middle of the travel lane, right? The obvious things.
Yeah.
But generally, the county is not permitting utilities in the sense of telling PGE or any other utility what the specs are for their line. The PUC
But we do
has
safety reviews.
safety standards. Only the utility permitting. There's no.
Okay.
No, really, we don't. So the PUC and there's like the federal, I don't remember the name of the acronym, but it's like the Pipeline Safety Management Agency under the
Okay.
U.S. Department of,
Yeah.
there are like federal and state regulations that PGE and Northwest Natural have to follow. So no, the county is not weighing in on that aspect of safety for these lines. I'm sorry, I want to clarify something Commissioner Savas said because I want to make sure we don't have a misunderstanding. I heard the same thing you heard, Commissioner Savas, about at the public meeting that you had where PGE said we're going to go through the land use process. And indeed, they've filed an application for an alteration of a nonconforming use. But that's not something that we can hold them to that commitment if we change the code, right? So if we were to change the code and say all lines are now outright permitted, that will apply to this Stafford project the same way it would any other project. So just want to be sure.
Okay.
That's not what the Planning Commission recommendation would do because they require condemnation in that case. At least that's what we believe right now. But just want to be clear, they could withdraw their application and take advantage of any new code amendments that you pass.
Are we also making a good kind of discriminating, and I don't mean that in an inflammatory word, but there is maybe a disparate impact or discriminating a little bit based on lines above ground, really, transmission lines above ground, and not really caring any more of what's below ground. But is there instances where there is actual impact where we're right? Like I guess all other utilities that are often underground, we're cool with, whatever, just go forward, yay. But they were kind of pointing out this essential utility as like, we're going to be a little more like scrutinizing towards you and skeptical. Like I'm trying to figure out like if that is good public policy here or not. Right. As we kind of split this. Like, I don't know if you could speak to that.
Right. So I can tell you from my perspective, again, I'm not an expert either. I've learned a lot through this process, but I do think with the Commissioner Savas, gas lines, I have to I think the Planning Commission's articulated safety concerns about gas lines. And I think, I'm not saying that a conditional use permit process doesn't allow the public to weigh in on whether something's safe or not, but the county is not going to have safety standards for the gas line. They would be following whatever state and federal law says is required. So potentially, the conditional use process might not be particularly valuable in that context, because the experts are going to say, we're going to follow the federal and state law, and, that's kind of maybe the end of the discussion. For the power lines, there has been this discussion that played out at the Planning Commission about underground transmission lines. And PG has made a point, it's, I believe in some of the testimony in your packet, that it isn't that underground transmission lines have no impacts. I mean, they need like a 40-foot wide easement, is my understanding, and they're not going to put that under the pavement, and they need to have vaults to access, and, there are still potentially impacts. But certainly the visual impacts are different, and at least there's an argument that they are more resilient. They're also incredibly more expensive.
And just interject there, yeah, they visually also have an impact because you can't plant trees over
Correct.
a giant swath of land,
Yes.
so there's no barrier between the road if you go underground, and all of those beautiful trees, like, you may have actually more of a tree canopy impact by going underground than you would by having the lines go above ground. So I'm just trying to, it does feel a little bit like we're being hyper skeptical about this kind of infrastructure building and pretending like the underground doesn't have a huge infrastructure impact on local communities when it does, just in a different way. But both underground, which, now you have groundwater issues and all other kinds of things. What if the Cascadia, all kinds of stuff. We can go down the rabbit hole. But they all have tree impacts, which that's it. So I don't know, it's almost like we're kind of picking and choosing which utility we want to work well with.
So the Planning Commission recommendation would cover both below ground. As drafted, it does cover underground and above ground, but only for, and distribution and transmission, but only for natural gas and electric, not for water, communication, sewer.
And the reality is we don't have the capacity as a county to deal with thousands. That's why we're here.
That's why we're here, right? And they're not all new lines, but once you require a conditional use permit, then every modification to every line, we're talking about, is this a non-conforming use? Should they have a conditional use? Do they need, it is hugely
We can't fund
labor-
it, we can't do it, it's not realistic. Yeah. Okay, Commissioner Savas.
Yeah, so I think just to build on that, that's why I feel comfortable. I was first elected in year 2000, 2001. Here we are 23 years later. This is the first one I think I can recall that's related to transmission. Okay. So it's going to be a rarity. It's not going to be a common thing. And this would, again, streamline staff. They wouldn't have to do as much work. And also on the development side, that would help them as well. So it's a win-win. So as I see this, and everything I've heard, I think there's no harm done by getting this right. But I want to restate one other thing. I am concerned that if this is appealed, it could be possibly appealed if it hinges on simply whether or not it's on private property and requires a combination process versus right of way. I don't think that's defensible. So that's why this, making it transmission, would accomplish, I think, everything that everyone wants, other than that rare instance in which transmission lines are due. So I had staff craft a motion, which I'm willing to make.
I will, thank you, Commissioner Savas. I will entertain a motion.
Okay. So I move that we approve ZDO 288 as recommended by the Planning Commission with the additional edit by staff with the following recommendations: to change, quote, natural gas to gas, and to require a conditional use permit for gas and electric utility transmission lines on land not owned or controlled by the utility provider, but not for distribution lines.
We have a motion. Do I have a second to that motion? The motion dies by failure to receive a second.
I've got a motion to make.
Okay, Commissioner Savas would like to make a motion. I'll entertain the motion.
You mean Commissioner Scholl?
Sorry, thank you, Commissioner Scholl.
Okay, I move that we approve ZDO 288 as recommended by the Planning Commission with the additional edit by staff as presented, period.
I have A motion from Commissioner Scholl. Do I have a second?
Clarification, you mentioned edit. What edit was that?
That's what was presented on the slides today.
The right-of-way definition edit, just to pick up that second part of the legal definition.
Do I have a second to that motion?
I'll second that for the sake of discussion right now.
Okay, we have the motion by Commissioner Scholl was that he moved that we approve ZDO 288 as recommended by the Planning Commission with the additional edit by staff as presented. It was seconded by Commissioner Schrader. We will now move to discussion on this motion. Commissioner Savas.
So I might ask both Commissioner Scholl and Schrader to see if they have an issue with at least, let's just take them one at a time, but at least taking the word natural gas and changing it to gas. I've heard no resistance from anyone on that.
I've given that some thought, Commissioner Savas. Right now, we are only concerned with natural gas. Should there come a time in the future that a utility wants to put another gas line, another form of gas, like hydrogen, that's a different issue. That's going to require new right-of-way and a totally new thing. So that's why I think we should leave that out.
Commissioner Schrader.
I think we need to be as clear with this as possible. I certainly do have some apprehension about this long-term. I will vote yes today on this, but I would like to make a comment to everyone out there. I've participated in a number of these kinds of issues, and that transmission as well as distribution is something critically important for public safety, particularly in an emergency. And my concern is if we block trying to have additional capacity, given what we're facing with emergency issues and catastrophes that we've already experienced, that's like ice storms, it's wildfires, things of that sort, that increased capacity and redundancy is going to become extremely important. And if we don't acknowledge that as a society we need those kinds of redundancies to mitigate life and public safety, that's something that I just want to let people know that should be something you're thinking about. And occasionally the trade-off is whether you have a transmission line because of the redundancy needs and the distribution needs, or you don't. One of the things I'm seeing in my local community is has nothing to do with PGE directly, but for example, we have a large area that is a blackout area for public safety in the event of an emergency because people did not want to have a cell tower that would enable our public safety folks to get there and get that information and get that out. The same thing goes for electricity and transmission. I did participate in a dark sky scenario at the National Association of Counties, and I'm just letting folks know, without those kinds of redundancies, we could have some very dire consequences. That, for me, is the larger picture. I will be prepared to vote yes on this motion, but I also feel it's my duty to let folks know that without these kinds of redundancies and these opportunities and the increased need we're going to have for electricity and the safety of the grid and as a whole, it could potentially put folks in peril. I don't want to be a doomsday person, but that is something that folks need to be aware of. That's all I have to say.
Commissioner Savas.
Yeah. Couple things. So in response, if I understood Commissioner Scholl correctly, he felt that a hydrogen gas line would require a new right-of-way and potentially, yeah. And I would suspect not, right? However, if it was a transmission line, whether it be natural gas or hydrogen, I would think that it might, because of the size, could require a different right-of-way. So just want to make that clarification, at least what my understanding was. And to Commissioner Schrader, those large transmission lines, whether they're electrical or they're underground or above ground, or gas lines, whether they're above ground or below ground, there are some that are above ground in the country, not anywhere in Oregon that I'm aware of, but they're huge safety issues. Those are massive safety issues, and there have been spills and so forth with oil lines and so forth. So I think that if that's the case, then we ought to be cognizant of that. There's nothing about making it a conditional use that there's nothing that says, no, it can't happen. All it is the process. So we're not saying no and not recognizing that responsibility. I concur with that responsibility to meet the needs. I think that's what we're elected to do. It's just how the process goes. And that's why I'm advocating. That's why I can't support the motion as presented.
It's interesting. We have state policy and some federal policy that wants us to light up the world like a Christmas tree and go full electric with everything, but there are real impacts to that. I don't know how everybody wants us to not even drive gas cars anymore in Oregon. They want every car to be electric. I don't know how we're going to charge those cars. We do not have the ability to do any of that. And the same people, at least in Oregon, who promote some of these really extreme, I think, environmental policies that aren't as practical, this is some of the local outcome to some of those policies. If we are going to go fully electric the way we talk about, and so not that we can't. I mean, we elect people to make decisions and represent us, but they have made those decisions for us to be electrified. And then there's just the reality of what we need in a local Clackamas County. I share some of the angst that Commissioner Schrader has just presented to us, and that reality that we see on the national level, not just in Oregon. I don't like we need infrastructure. We have to have infrastructure, and we have to have essential utilities. But the truth is we also really pride ourselves on an essential public process that allows people to have their voice heard in local communities. And that's exactly what Commissioner Savas spoke to. So we have these are competing right now. These two things are competing. And so I'm still weighing out where I'm going to go with this motion. But I do think at a local level, we have a responsibility to make sure that people have an avenue to have their voice heard, even on transmission lines. I think that is also essential. But this is not, and this is just like a really hard vote. Like, I'm just being honest, like somebody that lives in this community and cares about it, and also cares about my neighbors. This is the one that has me a little perplexed and conflicted. And I hope we get it right today, guys. I hope we get it right. Commissioner Scholl, you're up.
We are here today to consider ZDO 288. We're not to speculate on the future beyond what is our mission today. We have our responsibility today. PGE has a responsibility today and for the future. So does Northwest Natural Gas. Let's focus on the business at hand, ZDO 288.
I believe we have the chair ready to speak also. Can we get her?
Thank you. I've been listening to all sides of this and quite carefully. I don't disagree with any what the commissioners have said. This is why I'm going to support the motion. This is a solution that I believe is extremely elegant. If you would just stop and take a look at what this proposal does. It allows both sides of the issue to go forward and have more of a say in what is going to be proposed or built. PGE has to go through this CUP or nonconforming use, and they have to state exactly what they're going to do if they're outside the right-of-way. It gives the opportunity for the peoples whose lands are the most impacted to come forward to the hearings officers at Clackamas County to make their case why this should not happen. Whereas this may not be the most perfect solution in a perfect world, I'd like to remind everybody, this is a land use process in the state of Oregon. No one of the commissioners created this land use process. It has morphed over 30 to 40 years of layer upon layer upon layer, basically taking away local control and punting it down the football field to let somebody else do it. I am conflicted on some of the issues, but I think if I'm hearing right, we need to allow Portland General Electric the ability to expand for growth. This does that through a legal process. And we also need to allow for the people in the communities who they feel need to be heard, who they feel have the impacts to their personal, real property, to have a chance to go forward and say, no, do something else. And that's why I'm going to support this today moving forward. I really appreciate all the commissioners' comments on this, but just for the ease of elegance and simplicity, I'm going to go ahead and support this.
Commissioner Savas.
Yeah, one thing I forgot to mention, and that is that, and maybe I alluded to it, but I just want to make it perfectly clear, that if hydrogen came out tomorrow, you know, without that word change, they could just do it. They want, let's just say it's distribution. They could just do it. So there's no way of recalibrating, right? And if they put an application in tomorrow, once that application is submitted, if I understand correctly, typically, you can change the land use afterwards, but you can't change that application, right? They're allowed to do it because they applied while it was legal. So that's one thing I think maybe that was not factored, or at least said. I'll say at least said. The other one is to Commissioner Smith's point. I appreciate that. But I think it's odd. I agree about local control and local voice, but it's odd that we're taking it away from ourselves as government leaders for local control and only applying it to the property owner. And I think that's not quite right. I'm not sure that's defensible, but I agree 100% with local control, and this actually enhances it. I really like a lot of it, so it's going to give me a little bit of pain to vote against it, but I think having the foresight, to Commissioner West's point, the state of California, all their energy experts, they know they can't do it on electrical alone. That's why hydrogen is a big deal, and it's part of their program. They're expanding it, and they cannot do it. There's no way they can meet that electrical demand. That's why they're relying on hydrogen. It's already there. It's coming. It will be here. So I just think we need to accommodate that in the language.
I will say, as we deliberate on this motion, I support your change from natural gas to gas. I believe I heard Chair Smith say she would support it. It is not our motion, but I don't know, but I do believe the majority of the board would support an amendment if the maker of the motion would entertain it.
Okay, I will make this amendment. I stand by my motion as stated with the modification to strike the word natural in the ZDO,
Okay.
as in referring to natural gas. Thank you.
Do I second that?
Does a second agree?
I'll second that. Yeah,
Okay.
that's fine.
We've opined a lot. Unless anybody else has another comment, I would like to call the vote on this motion that's before us and see where this lands. Are we okay with that, board? Thank you. Caroline, please call the poll on this motion.
Yes. Commissioner Schull?
Aye.
Commissioner Savas?
No.
Commissioner Schrader?
Aye.
Vice Chair West?
Aye.
Chair Smith?
Aye.
Looks like the motion passes 4-1. Okay. With that, get back to my script here. That motion passes 4-1, and that will now, let's see. Do you? Yeah, I will now close the public hearing, being that there's no further business before us.
Vice Chair West?
Yes.
There's another paragraph underneath the motion is approved /
Oh,
lost.
sorry. Sorry about that. Yes, we'll go back over there. Okay, the proposal has been approved as recommended by the Planning Commission with the additional edit by staff. I will now direct staff, and with the natural gas amendment, thank you. I will now direct staff to draft the ordinance reflected by this decision and include it on the agenda for the board's adoption at an upcoming business meeting. Now with that, I don't think we have anything else from our board. So I will now close the public meeting. Being that there's no further business, this meeting is adjourned. Thank you, everybody.